The Pope is making headlines today after the Vatican charged a critic of his with the crime of schism and denial of the legitimacy of the Pope. The critic, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, is the former Vatican ambassador to the U.S. and has long been outspoken against the Pope. Vigano has called the Pope a liberal servant of Satan and called for his resignation and arrest. Vigano, who said the accusations against him were an honor, will now have to face a rare penal canon trial. And in other Pope news, a student has called on Pope Francis to stop using anti-LGBTQ+ language. In a panel discussion between the Pope and students, one student said the Pope's use of offensive language against the LGBTQ+ community has caused immense pain. The student went on to say he's been outcast and bullied due to his bisexuality. In the Pope's response, he spoke against discrimination but did not directly address the student's request. It comes after the Pope has faced backlash for reports that he used offensive language against gay men in a closed-door meeting. Reportedly, the Pope said gay men should not be allowed to train for the priesthood and used an offensive slur. The Pope later apologized to those who were hurt. Now, I heard a comedian say that the Pope is allowed to say that word because he's gay-coded, because he wears a fancy dress and fancy hat. Of course, she was being cheeky, saying if I was PR for the Pope, this is how I would handle it. But I think an apology is a better handling of it than that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess the problem was he said it once, and then the Vatican apologized on his behalf, and then there was a report that he said it again, which was obviously not great judgment. But it's interesting, you know, to see the quick shift, I think, from a couple of years ago when Pope Francis had made this public statement, it was a little bit, I think, vague, but gave the impression that the Catholic Church was changing its stance on how it viewed gay sexual relationships. And then he also took flack from some conservative Catholics even more recently for saying that it was okay to bless same-sex unions in another sort of confusing statement, which when you actually read it was talking about how you can bless individual people who are in same-sex unions. You can't bless the union itself. It's kind of complicated. But he's long been accused of basically giving too much ground to things that are considered opposed to church teaching. But then he comes out and drops like an anti-gay slur, and now the LGBTQ community is like, wait, we thought you were on our side. What's going on?
Which side are you on, Pope Francis? Do you see him as a liberal, as our resident member of the Catholic community,
Yeah.
a liberal servant of Satan?
A liberal, yeah. Servant of Satan, no.
Okay.
No, I don't have any evidence of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of people who are misunderstanding, I think, what's actually going on here with the Archbishop. The truth is that the Archbishop is very revered in the United States because of his help with exposing some of the child sex scandals in the church, which is obviously a great service. But his language in promoting disunity in the church and going after the Pope quite explicitly. He's also been accused of bringing people into the priesthood that are not properly trained. I mean, those are just obviously not acceptable under Catholic canon, and so I wouldn't be surprised to see him ultimately defrocked. And I think there's good reason for it.
Yeah, using a derogatory word like that, it definitely rocked people everywhere. So many people were talking about it. I know I had a Catholic grandmother, how important the Pope is to a lot of, Roman Catholics especially. And so she came here from Italy, and her husband died when my dad was a teenager. So I never met my grandfather, but I thought the Pope was my grandmother's boyfriend because his picture was always on the refrigerator. And we're like, who is this, Grandma? Like, why is he all over the fridge? And she's like, oh, it's my boyfriend. And we would see the Pope on TV and be like, oh, Grandma's boyfriend's on TV again. And I didn't realize that my grandmother didn't know the Pope until later in life. But a very important figure. So many people follow what the Pope says. I think it's very interesting to have this kind of hierarchy of who you're paying attention to and who's giving, religious doctrine, essentially, for this community of Catholics around the world. And so our politics has become divided, where people in different ideologies disagree on morals so heavily. And of course, there's going to be people that feel like they fall on different sides of a political spectrum, and that goes on to affect their religious beliefs, because the political spectrum involves statements that are pretty concrete and pretty on opposite sides around morality. And so we're at a point where the Pope's getting political.
Yeah, I consider myself pretty traditional, but there are elements of the so-called trad-cath movement that I think are very troubling. And one of those is that they tend to worship's not quite the right word, but obsess over this idea of pushing back against the Pope, which I think is not great for the church as a whole. In terms of the political question too, I think they often tend to take Pope Francis criticizing conservatives to mean criticizing like political conservatives in the United States. And his conception of what conservative means is, I think, a little bit different than how we understand it. So there's just a lot of complicated moving parts here, and people tend to try to look at it through this US political lens that's not always super helpful. And then there's also this common misconception where people think that if like the Pope says something, no matter what it is, that it's doctrine and you have to agree with it or you have to follow it. And the truth is, in order for the Pope to be speaking on doctrinal questions and to change an element of Catholic doctrine or an understanding of Catholic doctrine, there's a long process that goes into that, involving Vatican scholars and researchers and Catholic historians and theologians, and he would have to be exercising his authority to speak infallibly, which has only happened, I think, 3 or 4 times in modern history since the idea of papal infallibility actually became a part of Catholic doctrine. So if the Pope goes out and says something that like a trad-cath or a liberal Catholic disagrees with, it's not Catholic doctrine. He's just speaking, obviously as the Pope, we should respect him. That's sort of the view I take, is that I always respect what the Pope has to say and I try to understand it. But you don't have to agree with everything that the Pope says unless he's actually speaking from his authority as the Pope on a matter of Catholic doctrine.
Behind closed doors doesn't count. But do you think this is going to spark a larger conversation around whether or not a priest can be a gay man? And of course, we've had cases, come out where it's been exposed that priests have been gay men. Of course, it's already happened. But do you think it's going to open a larger conversation around how Catholics feel about having their priest be a gay man?
Yeah, I guess that's already happened in a sense in response to the sexual abuse scandal, because there was a backlash against allowing gay men to be priests because there was the perception that they would be more likely to abuse young boys in the church. But I think the general principle is still, and always has been, that you can have same-sex attraction and not act on it and still be a priest. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Right. I think your perspective on it's very interesting. We've talked about it on the show before, but this idea that, while it is a sin to be a member of the LGBTQ plus community, it's not that we as Catholics must shun them from society. It's that we're all sinners. And
and it's also not even just being a member of the community, but actively engaging in sexual activities that are with a member of the same sex. Just as if you were to have sex outside of marriage in a straight relationship, that would be considered a sin as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, because it is taboo, like my parents are not people who are anti-LGBTQ+, but they didn't grow up around it. And so there's, feelings of not understanding it, I think, and not fully understanding, the transgender community. And it's not hateful, but it's this skepticism. But I do think there are a lot of people that, find it to be just gross and weird and different and treat it differently than they would treat other sins like sex before marriage.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and we should definitely be mindful of making sure that we're not condemning certain sexual sins more than others. But I guess at the same time, you don't want to say that you treat every sin the same, because obviously murder would be worse than taking God's name in vain. So there's
That's
levels.
Very fair. All right, we're going to continue to follow Pope Francis and all of the controversy around him. More Rising after this.